In this lesson, we're going to take a look at managing local user accounts using command line tools. Now, there are basically three command line tools that we use for local user accounts. User add to add new users, user del to delete or remove users, and user mod to modify existing user accounts. So currently on this machine, I have the student user and root, and that's pretty much it. So if I wanted to add an account for myself, I'd use user add and the user account that I want to create. Now, user add did a whole bunch of stuff for me behind the scenes. For example, it added a new entry for this user to Etsy password, our user configuration file. So there's my new user account line. So we see my name, my user ID number, my primary group ID number, my home directory, and the login shell that this user should receive when they log into the machine. Alright, also, when using user add, I got a group added to the system down here at the bottom of Etsy group. Red Hat Enterprise Linux uses a scheme known as user private groups. So when you add a new user account, by default, they're going to get a group created for them that they're the only member of. And when we look at ownership of files created by this user, it's going to be their username and their private group as the default owner. Alright, also, it created a home directory for me. So here's my new user account home, and there's some stuff in there copied from another directory on the machine, a template directory. Alright, so user add will create this home directory for your user, and then it'll recursively copy the contents of Etsy Skell to the home directory, and then it uses chown to change the ownerships of these files to be the new user account. So if there's a directory structure you want new users to receive on your machine, you can create any directories or files that you want under Etsy Skell, and then when you use user add, by default, it'll create the home directory and copy that directory structure from Etsy Skell to the user account's home. Alright, now all that stuff that I just talked about being the defaults can be overridden with options to user add. So I'll take a quick look at user add syntax diagram by using it incorrectly. And we can see all the different options that we can use to make changes to how this is being created. So for example, baster, this is the option you can use to use a directory other than Etsy Skell to be the foundation directory for seeding a new user's home. You could set a user's home to another directory besides /home/ their name. You could set their primary group ID number instead of their using their private group. You can assign them as a member to other supplementary groups. You could tell user add to not create a home directory, to not create a private group, to change what their login program should be, to assign their user ID number. Alright, and then there's one option in here, -P, that looks very attractive, but you probably don't want to use it. So user add will create the user account definition, but it turns out one of the things it does not do automatically is set a password for the person. So after you add them, as root, you have to set a password for that person. And because I'm root, I can even use bad passwords. A normal user would not be able to set themselves up a bad password. But now that I've set the user account's password, this person can log in. In the next session, we're going to take a closer look at passwords and using some other utilities for managing passwords. Right, but the reason I bring this up is that I want to talk about this -P option for user add. Alright, so to the layperson, one might look at this command and go, oh, okay, user add, great, we're adding a new user, -P and our password, and our user that we're going to create. So we're going to create a Joe user, and their password is going to be set to the word fluffy. Right, but in reality, this doesn't work the right way. Notice in the syntax diagram for -p, it says that this should be the encrypted password of the new account. And here's what -p does. It takes the argument it was provided on the command line and assigns that exact string as the encrypted password for this person. Our encrypted passwords by default get stored in Etsy Shadow. So here's the password for the user account I just set using the password command, and here's the password I just set using user add. Notice the difference. This one that I set with the password utility is an encrypted password, whereas this one I set with user add just took the string that I assigned to -p and assigned that as the person's password. Alright, so if you want to use -p, you really need to make this second field something more like this. Right, it has to be the encrypted password that you want to use for this user, the already encrypted password. Now because of that, that makes it kind of less useful, and most people opt to not do it this way. Right, especially when you can run the password command and provide a plain text password, and it'll take care of doing all the encrypted bits behind the scenes for you. Alright, so user add adds a new user, a bunch of different options change how they're added to the system. To delete a user, notice there's not a lot of options with delete user or user del. -F to force it. -R to remove the user's home directory. And -Z to remove this person as an SE Linux user if they are tagged as such. Alright, so really the one that you're probably most interested in is -R. So if I want to delete the Joe user, let me take a look at the hidden files too. Right, in the home directory there's the Joe user. If I just use user del on Joe, he gets cleansed from the Etsy password file, and his private group gets removed, and his entry in Etsy Shadow with his password gets deleted, but in home, his home directory still persists. And if we look at a long listing of it, it ends up being owned by a user ID number. So if this user ID number were to be reused, like I add the user Sally, and by default user add takes the first available user ID number, alright, let me try that again, the last available user ID number over 500. So user ID 500, 501, and 502 are already in use. 503 then becomes the last available over 500. So it gets reassigned to Sally, and because of that, Sally also inherits ownerships of the Joe user's files that were also owned by UID 503. Alright, so to keep this from happening, typically when I remove a user, I make a backup or an archive of their home directory. So if at any point I need to restore those files, I can do so. And then I actually remove them with the -R option, which will delete their home. So if I look at home now, notice the Sally directory that was down here is no longer there. And there is no user ID 503 anymore, so it goes back to being owned by a user ID number. Now I as root could also just remove this home directory. Alright, so now we've cleaned up the Joe user account. Alright, so user del removes the entry for the user from the configuration files like Etsy password, Etsy group, and Etsy shadow, but by default will not remove the user's home. If you want to remove the user's home, you have to use the -R option to recursively remove their home directory. Alright, the last command line utility that we use for local user management is usermod. Alright, so if I look at the usage for user mod, it basically uses the same types of options as user add for making changes to the user. So I could do things like change their primary group or add them to additional groups. I could use this to set their password, but just like user add, it has to be an already encrypted string as their password. I could change the person's UID number, their login shell. Alright, then a couple of cool ones. Lock. So this will make it so that even though the user has a valid password, they're not able to log in. And its partner, unlock. So you can lock them if you don't want them to be able to log in, and then unlock them when they are permitted to log in using that password. And then we have things like move home if you need to move them from /home to another directory structure for some reason. -L, so you're changing their username to something different. So somebody has changed their actual name, which would change their user ID. You can use -L to make the change. All right, so managing your local users, that's what we do with user mod. Not people that we want to delete, and maybe people that we've added with the defaults, but now want to make some changes to them to match a more global configuration ideal. All right, there's also some things up here like expire date and inactive. We're going to talk about that in the next section when we talk about password management and account management. All right, so user add, user mod, user del. And remember that when you're using user add to add a user account, typically you'll also want to use password command to set their initial password. Otherwise, the account will be locked and they won't be able to use it until you set their initial password.